Thank you. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends of Convoco, welcome to the 2019 Convoco Forum. The topic this year is the standing of Europe in the new Imperial world order. The topic is Europe, and not only the European Union, which, as an institution, is the political representation of at least part of Europe. In its history, Europe has been redrafted and renegotiated again and again. Up until now, Europe is an idea which is yearning to materialize. Our key question today is, how can we create a single entity from the national diversity of which Europe consists? A unity where every nation can live its own individual life. And at the same time, their sovereignty is restricted to such an extent that it's possible to act internationally as a single entity. Now, can we answer this question? That's a question that is doubtful more than ever before. Europe has lost trust in itself. Just think of Brexit. On the other hand, its central global position setting the tone is no longer there. Europe's political vision no longer determine the future of the world. And this is reflected in the English title of our forum, The Standing of Europe in the New Imperial World Order. And that's why Convoco will be discussing Europe this year. What is Europe? How is it defined? What does it stand for? What values, ideas, and concepts does it embody? It is very difficult to define Europe geographically. You will realize right away that there is no clarity when trying to answer the question, what is Europe? Even if you approach Europe in the history of ideas, because it will become clear very quickly that Europe and its Christian roots and principles of enlightenment are now in an identity crisis. We are observing our time, a time in turmoil, anger, confusion, and prejudices, and radicalization of people is something that is often contradictory. And this doesn't make things any easier. So one thing is clear. This is what we need to achieve. We're talking here about creating a single entity because of our diversity, because of our differences, and not a question of making an entity out of diversity. A prerequisite for this is that we acknowledge the other's identity. That means by mutual acknowledgement of their differences. The motto of the American Republic, E pluribus unum, is not an option for Europe, at least at the current time when we consider advancing nationalization of the individual countries. And it's not just national differences. We also have historical contrasts that need to be bridged. Since the refugee issue, we have seen that the political mood has intensified in all of Europe, and we can see a clear division between Eastern and Western Europe. Let's have a look at what values and ideas make up Europe's identity. In terms of our culture, Europe is characterized by the spirit of Christianity, which goes back to Roman, Greek, and Jewish tradition. At the same time, it's the ideas of enlightenment that make Europe what it is. Europe stands for freedom, democracy, and individuality, and these are the rights of the individual. The legal guarantee of our individual freedom which is something that was developed in the 17th century in England. The purpose of a state governed by rule of law are as follows: moderation of state power, guarantee of basic and human rights, self-determination, the right of citizens to have recourse to judicial protection. The highest achievement of enlightenment is the separation of state and church, a secular state, in other words. Only then was it possible for science to become established as an authority. At the same time, the Christian principle of charity, brotherly love, and humility took shape in the welfare state. What's important here is that from the very beginning of Christianity, they took a universal approach. It addresses all human beings, irrespective of their faith. Europe's concepts take a Janus-faced or two-sided approach. In addition to bright, enlightened sides, we also have another side. The appearance of this other side is something that we can observe right now. Nationalism or democracy is accompanied by nationalism, because without a national population, there will be no democratic policymaking. While tolerance, freedom, and justice have been established within the continent, at the same time, we saw that there was European imperialism and colonialism, supported by a feeling of superiority, suppression, slavery, and rejection of others. One feature in Europe that we cannot imagine doing without is the fact that, on the one hand, it is based on inclusion, and on the other hand, on exclusion. Continentalization took place in the 17th century, in particular compared with non-European cultures. Europe began to develop a European awareness. All walks of society were combined: economic and social order, fashion, architecture, science, and technical progress. European awareness saw itself as its own self as being evolved historically and culturally by creating real and fictitious contrasts. The structures of cultural differences served to delimit oneself with regard to the outside world. In history, outsiders were seen as primitive, wild, and exotic. They were excluded. Up until today, immigrants are rejected again and again because they are non-European. The modern awareness can be reduced to the formula coined by the French historian Jean-Baptiste de Roussel: Europe vis-à-vis the Turks, Europe vis-à-vis America, and Europe vis-à-vis itself. In the 17th century, Rubens reflected Europe in his paintings. Christian Europe is threatened by the Orient. Since the fall of Constantinople in 1453, the Muslim Empire, the Ottoman threat, was the identity-creating others for Christians. And there were also internal power struggles destroying Europe. Over the whole 17th century, there were only 3 years in Europe where no battle was fought, and this resulted a European longing for peace. But all of this doesn't make Europe what it is today. The original European ideas of enlightenment also include the EU concepts: the common market, equal treatment, EU citizenship, and today, austerity. Of these principles, the common market ranks number 1. The EU is the largest economy of the world, with a GNP of 31,000 euros per capita and 500 million consumers. At the same time, the EU is the world's largest trading bloc. The common market, however, cannot create identity. It's a mechanism. It's not warmth, it's not a home country, nor is it a feeling of security. The European Union, in other words, the political union in Europe, is emotionally in the need of meaning, because the EU today has taken an economic path and not a cultural path. As Hans Magnus Enzensberger put it back in 1986, the propagandists of the common market have, over time, forgotten all of the Western pretensions. Instead of the idea, we now see these have been replaced by interests, and the thoughts or ideas which were considered so urgent in the past have now become unnecessary. Right now, we only have one essential narrative of values, and that is Europe as a peace project. We also need to add new, meaningful narratives. In order to create a social cohesion throughout Europe, which is supported by emotions. And we shouldn't forget that Europe began as a literary motif. It might be interesting to note that the name Europe was used for the first time in Homer's Iliad. Herodotus used the term in the 5th century for countries north of the Mediterranean that do not belong to Asia. Today, Europe is in transition between independent nation-states and a united Europe. These times of transformation lead to insecurity. Orientation is lost. Certain factors cease to exist, which served as our cultural framework. Transitions, therefore, require rituals and emotional support. And, ladies and gentlemen, that is exactly what is lacking. So we should spend more time thinking about what makes Europe what it is in cultural terms. And then we should create rituals which will celebrate this transition. But not only that. Europe is also confronted by the fact that economic innovation in the field of digitization is virtually non-existent. And here comes a very important question. To what extent are the values and concepts in Europe which make Europe unique, to what extent are they also an obstacle in the new world? And how do these values need to be adapted in order to pave the way for Europe in the new century or even into the new millennium? So how do we need to make use of these values? Let's take as an example the principle of the rule of law. It has been proven that the rule of law is the strongest factor which promotes economic growth, way above democracy. Law is an essential means to restrict uncertainty for the future. Legally binding agreements make the future predictable. But we have still a large amount of uncertainty, and it's this uncertainty which is the main requirement for capitalist economies. It opens up opportunities for innovation and creativity. Uncertainty can be a constituent requirement for capitalist economies. Asian countries have realized that the protection of private property and a liberal entrepreneurial culture are essential factors for economic success. And this is the weak point. Has Europe perhaps exaggerated the principle of rule of law? Has the rule of law, at least in Western democracies in Europe, become an obstacle to innovation? With excess rules. This is one of the major criticisms of the EU. And taking this one bit further, maybe this could be another reason for Brexit. Because in addition to Germany, it was the UK in particular that sees rule of law as having great value and following the requirements of Brussels dutifully. But ladies and gentlemen, don't misunderstand me. The principle of rule of law is one of the most important features of our European identity, and it is a prerequisite for living together in freedom. It's traffic regulations and their observance that allow free circulation for road users on an equal footing. That is important. And the rule of law is a prerequisite for our basic and human rights. A major advantage is the fact that Europe has always evolved throughout its history. And today we're talking about a project in the making, a work in progress that is far from complete. In the past, Europe has shown that it can change. It can redefine itself. And by adjusting and changing, it can also remove violence from change. This project of a unified Europe has not failed. One thing is for sure, business as usual is not an option. In 2013, Convoco discussed dealing with downturns, choices and strategies for uncertain times. Only the unwise don't expect to be able to fail. Wise people know that failure or downturns can be a part of successful activity. Karl Popper, a philosopher, showed science how failed attempts can be used to arrive at findings. If we apply this to the Project Europe, that is what we can do. A project which has been ongoing for centuries cannot be abandoned when it is needed most urgently. Europe is a project which began back in the 16th century. And since then, the term Europe has not disappeared. At the award ceremony for the International Charlemagne Prize, Antonio Guterres said, "Europe is too important to fail." That would also be a failure of the rule of law. As Secretary General of the United Nations, I see the necessity for strong and united Europe, and I've never seen it as clearly as and felt it as clearly as I do today. Today, we have to think about perhaps whether a larger political unity might be absolutely necessary in order to be a global player, in order to counter global challenges, and also to be a counterweight to global digital companies such as Amazon, Google, and Facebook, because they too are also part of the new imperial world order. Will the 21st century be the Asian century? After centuries of colonialism and division by the Cold War, cohesion is returning to Asia. Asia's economies have been gaining strength for years now. Asian internal trade nearly doubled between 2009 and 2016 from 29 to 57%. And it's not only individual economies, it's also the entire Asia region which is gaining strength as a single trading area. What is new here is the extent of trade relations amongst non-Western regions. So this means that existing trade dependencies to the United States and Europe are disappearing. For Europe, this means that both in the West and in the East, we are up against two strong trading areas. The America First policy in the United States is forcing the EU towards more independence militarily and economically. At the same time, American protectionism is calling on Europe and Asia to build up new trade relations. As Chancellor Merkel has already said, days in which we could fully rely on one another, these days are gone, at least to a certain extent. We Europeans need to take control of our own destiny. And if we look to the near future, you must not lose sight of Africa. Africa has set up a continental free trade zone, the CFTA. And if this is a success, then this will create a market of 1.2 billion people today with an economic output of 3 trillion euros. So what we need is that we need to reposition ourselves amongst the changed geopolitical forces. We need to determine values and rituals which will emotionally support Europe in its new positioning. And we need to develop strategies which will dissolve dependencies. I'm looking forward to discussing these ideas with you today. And now I'm happy to hand over to Professor Jörn Leonhard. He'll be talking on the topic of Europe from a historical perspective. Welcome, Professor Leonhard.